All right, welcome back to the end of the world with Michael and Stu.
I'm Michael.
And I'm Stu. And today we're talking about an exciting film directed by Davis Guggenheim. It's 2006 Al Gore-centric feature, An Inconvenient Truth.
His star turn.
Yeah, finally he takes
broke through. He
takes the main stage after some time in the shadows, we might say, overshadowed by a slightly more popular and famous figure for the 1990s. But before that, I just wanted to bring up a recent news story that I think bears a little bit on the potential end of the world. Michael, have you heard about this alleged Russian satellite destroying nuke program?
Vaguely. Why don't you just bring me up to speed here? What are we doing these days?
So apparently, since the Ukraine war, Russia has been conducting these clandestine sort of tests of a scary, frightening new technology. Which this past week, the Pentagon has and so the State Department have gone on this sort of PR blitz about this new potential danger. Basically, the idea is that Russia is going to put nukes up in orbit and is going to be able to blow them up in such a way that they won't hurt us. We'll be fine. But our ability to access GPS, the internet, our make cellular.
Not Waze.
Yeah,
Waze is going to eat shit.
Even Waze will potentially be disrupted, sadly.
Or it'll just be Putin's voice as the only option.
Yeah, hello, America. Yeah. That would be good. No, what do you think about this? Does this move us? Is this like ticking the doomsday clock, closer to midnight?
I mean, it does. It just seems like we're just throwing kindling on the fire, Like we're just getting it from as many angles as possible, and now we're getting it from the angle of outer space too, which I think is kind of because what you're saying. The nukes themselves, if I'm correct,
yeah,
they're in orbit. They're not pointing up. Is that right?
Oh, no, yeah, they're like on some kind of space nuke platform.
How long did it take for this to become not clandestine anymore? Like how long it took? Did we know the whole time? Probably.
I'm assuming so. And one always has to wonder, like, what is it about mid-February 2024 that necessitates this news coming out? I'm not entirely. Is it a wag the dog situation? Because there's disagreement. Some people are like, this isn't actually, we're not sure this is happening. So far, they've only put test objects into space. We don't know if they're gonna any plans to load an actual, fully nuclear armed.
Whenever I hear something like this, I'm like, I mean, a potential end of the world apocalyptic event aside, I'm like, so is the US like, oh man, why didn't we think of that? Or obviously they're doing it too. Like this doesn't even sound like that crazy of an idea. It seems like I'm sort of surprised it hasn't happened.
Well, the reason it hasn't happened
already
is because there's a 50-year-old.
It's hard to do.
Well, there's yeah, the Pentagon budget is just not big enough, Michael.
Yeah.
No, there's a 50-year-old treaty that says essentially no nukes in space. Let's confine our
I like that.
Our planet-ending weaponry.
We can have them here. We can have them amongst us, so they're as close as possible to destroy us. But let's not get fucking crazy and put them out of space. Okay, let's keep our heads here.
Yeah. So if this story
oh my god, that's so funny.
Well, it's funny that was like one of the things the USSR and the USA were like, yes, let's shake on that. Like,
right? Was that like a Gorbachev initiative?
It was before that. I think.
Oh, was it?
It was
an early olive branch.
I think it was like Brezhnev era, like early.
Just
70s.
Keep this between us, okay? The moon's got nothing to do with this.
Yeah, exactly. And so if Russia does this, they will obviously withdraw from that treaty, which will cause the U.S. to also withdraw, right? So basically, there's just going to be, and then
it feels like we're in an era where treaties are going to have less and less.
Treaties are going by the wayside. Yeah,
it's up and down. It's a cyclical thing, much like Much like, global warming, according to the skeptics.
Ah,
Uh,
yeah, a good segue. So let's get into our main topic, which is, of course, the 2006 film directed by, as I said, Davis Guggenheim. Although I don't think anyone associates the film with him. I think the only name that comes to mind when you say An Inconvenient Truth is naturally Al Gore,
yeah,
our former vice
I don't even
president.
know Guggenheim. Did he do anything else? Is he one of the Guggenheims? I
I
don't know.
haven't researched this at all, so let's just assume
Yes. Let's
yes.
assume yes. Yeah.
um, so what do you remember about when this film came out, Michael? How old were you? What was your
Well,
life situation?
I was in my early 20s, and was definitely, I think we were already getting there was a little heat in Canada at the time, I think, with like shopping bags. If we're talking about like where we were at
Oh, okay, yeah,
in
yeah.
terms of like the environmental
Like
consciousness,
banning plastic
I
bags,
I
that
can't
kind of
say for
thing.
sure, but I get the sense, like, 'cause this was, again, this is now 18 years ago or whatever.
Yeah.
I feel like people were starting to, maybe the good guys were out there bringing their own bags
Uh-huh.
to the store. Maybe.
Which is now compulsory in certainly in New York where we live, but in a
Yeah,
larger.
I mean, politically, what I remember is that Gore, and we'll talk about this, I'm sure, but when he ran in 2000 and lost, as it were, um, he actually it was fairly muted, his environmental bona
You mean
fides. And
in
right, he
terms of
didn't
what?
run as an environmental crusader because they had tarred him as this kind of like whack job environmentalist, right?
Right.
And so it was there, but it was more often used as an attack against him, sort of being this like granola,
Yeah,
out of,
exactly.
totally out of the mainstream, going to destroy the American economy. We're not going to be able to eat hamburgers anymore, the usual thing. We can't fly, like that type of thing.
Yeah, yeah.
But by '06, I think America had gone through, obviously a serious, pretty rough run, right? You had the stolen, quote unquote, stolen election of 2000.
Yeah.
Bush obviously gets off to like a rough start, you know.
There was
Then we've got 9/11. Then we've got
an
two
incident.
wars.
Yeah, yeah.
Then we got John Kerry's uh, unfortunate run for the White House, and now we're sort of in, this is in May of '06. We're in this moment, I think, just before the wheels really start to come off for Bush. Wouldn't you
Well,
say?
I think the wheels were already on their way off after Katrina, right? I think for me, Katrina is, to use a bad pun, kind of when the dam breaks for Bush and people start to
Maybe. I mean,
really see
I
him
think
as being an
I think you're
incompetent.
probably right. I think that there's
Obviously,
levels to
what
Bush.
finishes him off is
Is
the
breaking the entire global economy on his way out the
yeah,
door.
yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah, sure. But yeah,
Because
I guess
I
that's
don't know if
true.
you
The
remember
Katrina.
in his 2005, like when he was reelected, when he was like sworn in, his speech was all about like creating what he described as, and this phrase is stuck in my head for almost 20 years. I don't know why, but an ownership society. And essentially, he wanted everyone in America to be able to buy a house, which
Yeah.
uh,
Mission accomplished.
buy it and then have it foreclosed upon and
Yeah.
retaken by the bank. Yeah. So yeah, I think the timing of this is interesting. So yeah, it comes out in spring 2006.
Yeah.
Uh, there are, and like the environment at that point was one of the ways you could really hit Bush just in the aftermath of
Yeah.
Katrina, right? And that's something we'll talk about a little bit later when we get into some of the responses to the movie. What do you know about Al Gore?
Well, Al Gore is probably like one of the earliest figures for me, right? Where, in the sense of like, I was in my late teens in 2000 when
Yeah.
the election was happening. And I mean, I don't know what your recollection of it was, but like I feel like I was so much less jaded then. And
Could
in many ways truly.
you couldn't vote in that election though because
No, I was a
you're a
year
U.S.
short.
citizen, but you're living
So
in
I was a U.S.
Canada.
citizen. Interesting story. I was a year short. I was 17, but I was living in Canada. But you vote in your last state of residency, which was Florida. So in fact,
Oh wow,
my brother and my mother were actually absentee ballots in Florida for the 2000 election.
that's awesome.
Uh, can't can't remember if my brother voted for Nader. I'm sure he entertain the idea, which, you know, sure he regrets now if he did, but, you know, that was the world ended that day when you cast a ballot for Ralph Nader. And I was like, but
Yeah,
yeah,
that's
and
awesome.
I remember the election. You know, I obviously remember Gore through my youth as kind of I associated him as the figure that the media had given me, you know,
Yeah,
this kind of like,
very sober, kind of
yeah, very boring,
boring.
very dull. And like, you know,
Yeah,
you had the like, who would you rather have a beer with election, right? It was
right.
essentially the 2000 election. But, you know, even at 17, you're like, at that time, my understanding of just the depths to which American politics were reaching, I didn't think there was any way that this Bush guy could like win. I really didn't. I was just like listening. And I'm like,
Oh,
this is
well,
so crazy.
yeah, it's interesting. Gore was the first election. I'm a little bit older than you, so I could vote, and I did in fact vote for Gore. And
Thank you
I
for
was,
your
yeah,
service.
yeah, yeah. That was, what is it? Marine Stu reporting for duty. What was
Yeah,
the
that was
that was,
Kerry
I know, I
in
know.
2004. Yeah, reporting for duty.
Sorry, I'm just Democrat, failed dem nominee, pilled at the moment. In any
Yeah.
case, yeah, I could vote, and unlike you, I thought Bush would probably win. But keep in mind, I went to a very conservative boarding school,
Hmm.
and this was my first year in college, the fall of my freshman year, and I was surrounded by people basically my whole life who were Republicans.
Sure.
And so I remember
Not so
being,
many of those in suburban Ontario,
no, no, no. I remember
at
being,
least at the time. Now they're all like that. So
yeah, yeah. I remember being even in like fifth grade in Connecticut, in Fairfield County. We had the '92 election. We took a class poll, and everyone in the class voted for Bush, and including me, because just peer pressure. The first Bush Senior, and the only people to vote against were the teachers. And I remember at the time being like, "Huh, why did the teachers like not like President Bush? Like what, you know?"
union scum, said fifth grades too.
But in any case, I had a very radical political awakening in the '99 to 2000 era, where I was like, wait a minute, like, yeah, it's
Was this
just
on the
so,
heels of Seattle, the battle for Seattle? Was that
no, no. I think it was just getting out of the like right wing, wear a suit and tie to high school every day,
Jesus? Yeah,
go to school 6 days a week, be surrounded by like just like hockey players and lacrosse players,
for
and
sure.
like just this sort of upper crust Connecticut vibe. As soon as I got out of that, I was like, oh, right, I'm like nothing like that, and I actually don't share any of their beliefs.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of, I think in terms of where it was by '06, it wasn't completely like out of nowhere to talk about the environment and climate change. Bush was definitely being hit for like not giving a fuck or thinking it was real or dithering,
Yeah,
you know,
yeah. Oh, and being tied to the
after
oil
promising Gore.
industry,
Yes, the Halliburton of it all, but also like promising Gore, you know, that he was going to do certain things, you know, classic Democrat behavior when conceding an election is like, make sure you get a task force out of it. Make sure you get a climate or whatever. And you know, they ended up not doing that. But
yeah.
of course, but it wasn't just too far removed from any environmental concern just being considered like pie in the sky. Like there's
Yeah,
this great quote in the movie that I think brings us to like where we
yeah,
were at and where Gore was at, where they have this clip of George Bush Sr.
yeah, in
earlier
'92.
in
Yeah,
92, where he's talking about how you should be fearing Al Gore, this vice president who's lurking, because he's such a whacked out environmentalist that, and the quote is, America will be up to its neck in owls. That was his critique of Al Gore. I don't know what that referred to,
I think
but
it's
like,
probably like environmental protection of species sort of thing.
Sure, like anti-business, I think maybe it means
Well,
like
that was the, because he also says that no one will have a job, right? I think that's the second part of the
right.
quote.
It's like
Like
the idea that there'd just be owls everywhere because Al Gore made it that we couldn't put up
kind of
malls,
a
right?
psychedelic image in a way, right?
It's
Just like
so funny.
like the
It's
world
so funny
over,
that like
just like like you're running as the
yeah,
owls.
like how do we hit our base? Like tell them we'll be up to our neck in owls. That'll scare the shit out of them.
Yeah,
Like
and I guess that's why
not even a threatening animal,
right,
just
not
owls.
like bobcats or
Mm.
cougars or something. Like yeah. So one last thing about this, like, why did Gore not run in 2004? Do you think? I mean, he won the popular vote by many accountings. He actually won the election, and the Supreme Court sort of pulled it out from under him. What do you think the calculus was in
Well,
2004?
I mean, again, I think that this whole era that we're talking about is really, there's this interesting book that Mike Duncan did, right? The Storm Before the Storm, I think
Oh
it's
yeah,
called. And it kind of like in a very truncated, shorter, hyper version, it feels like, you know, '01 or 2000, through to 16 is kind of this like similar situation on
Mike Duncan's
steroids.
book is about the like decline and fall of the Roman Republic, right?
Yeah,
Where you have
right.
this
And so
series of Sulla, Cinna, Marius are like going at it,
right,
and then
right.
Caesar and Pompey and those guys are the next
Yeah.
generation, and they really like kill it. So you're saying that this was like a run up to the kind
It's
of
like this, right? It's this
hyper
heavily
polarized
mediated, right?
Trump.
We're getting all of these the 24 news cycle, a generation of that coming home to roost since like the Gulf War. We're now a decade and change later, and these things are sort of starting to really have an effect. And so back then, I think there was probably just first of all more of a traditional thing that like you just wouldn't run again like that. It was like what the idea of, for example, Trump running again surprises nobody, you know, but I think there was
I think the Gore situation's a little different though. I mean, he I think his calculus was basically like after 9/11, Bush is too popular. That there's been too much of a swing behind him in the aftermath of, and that he didn't want to like step on that.
well,
I
I
think
think
there's like a
that's
weird misguided patriotism at play
I
is
think
what
Al
I'm
Gore
saying.
Al Gore was something of a coward, and I don't, I think
I mean,
like
Al Gore
very
did go to Vietnam, like
yes,
unlike
well, famously, yeah, but like I guess what I mean is like he's very emblematic to me of this whole era of democratic politics,
yeah,
right? From the post Clinton era all the way through to today, where I think that they never have understood the writing on the wall, like the scale of the polarization that has
yeah,
happened. And so, for example, like even considering Bush's popularity is so hilarious as a
yeah,
reason to not run as the opponent. If you are really then 2 years later doing a documentary about the looming end of the world, right? It's like
yeah,
it's totally at odds. The second thing is like what's funny is you would think he would be really well positioned given his pop like he had a shot in '04. I think we all would agree on that. He
yeah.
could he could definitely have,
I
have
think he
trumped up
would have done
his
better than Kerry
yeah,
probably.
and what would he could have made up what his reaction to these things would have been. He could have
Yeah,
taken all the popular positions, all the people who were like now seeing problems unfolding, obviously in Afghanistan, in Iraq, and been like, here's what I would have done, differently.
right. I think the thing is, by 2004, I'm not sure the tide had turned hard enough against Bush on Iraq and
Yeah, I
Afghanistan.
think that's right. That's right. I
And
mean, obviously it didn't. He beat John Kerry pretty
yeah,
more comfortably than he beat Gore,
I
right?
mean, it's the only time that the Republican has won the popular vote in the last 25 years, right? Maybe
Tip your
longer.
cap, take a bow,
Yeah.
John Kerry.
Anyway, let's get into Gore's bio. So his dad, he was born in 1948. His dad was also, and all this bio stuff is just from his website, Wikipedia, standard fare. His dad was already in Congress when he was born, and 4 years later would become a senator and would serve for 18 years. So he couldn't really hit Bush on the like nepotism charge, perhaps
Sure.
as hard as he might have liked to. He's from Tennessee, but he grew up in Washington, and going back to Tennessee in the summers. Was interested in politics from an early age. Went to Harvard in the mid to late 60s. Famously roommates with actor Tommy Lee Jones while there.
Where is
Uh,
that movie?
Tommy Lee Jones is oh no, just about them.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. That is
Although
kind
Tommy Lee Jones as Gore could work too, I think.
of sort of. I mean, he doesn't really look like him, but sure, why not? Fascinating detail. So I mentioned that Gore went to Vietnam. Um, Now he went as a member of like the Army Reporter Corps. I mean, he was like a journalist for the Army in Vietnam, and he did spend a year there. But he opposed the war as a undergrad at Harvard. He opposed the war, but he also opposed the protests against the war. And I think like this detail like really tells
This
you
is that's a
about
definitional moment for Gore's politics, I
I
think.
mean exactly, right? It's like it's he is the thing is historically we tend to think of environmentalism as you were alluding earlier as something that's associated with the kooky left, right?
Mhm.
um which in some measure, Woodstock generation, hippies, that kind of image we tend to associate with the left. I think quite wrongly, actually. This is a long argument that I'm having with myself primarily. I don't have too many interlocutors on this one. But basically, like I think people fail to register the degree to which like hippies, environmentalism, uh, are actually like right wing issues. Uh, in as much as hippies are famously Luddites, right?
Mhm.
They're against technology. They want to like go back to nature. And environmentalism is about conservation, literally conservative
True.
conservation, right? Now, I'm not saying conservative in like the 2024 Republican Party sense of the term at all, but like that actually there is like a strong historical connection between like conservation, conservative politics. You can go back to romanticism in the 19th century and talk about this. Anyway, that's something I'll bring up in more detail probably in a future episode. But I love I love the like ambivalence. Like I'm against the war, but I'm going to go to the war because I hate the protesters, and it's my
Right.
patriotic duty to go to war even though I'm against it. Also, his dad was running for re-election, and I think a big motivator for him was like, well, I gotta serve, I gotta do my part. Dad lost election, by the way.
Yeah, it
Uh,
sort of like follows him. It sort of follows him throughout his career, right? It's like
yeah,
I'm against the
because
Supreme Court's decision,
but
but I do respect it, and let's rally around our new president.
yeah, the other defining characteristic of Gore, besides his environmentalism, is, and again, this is somewhat paradoxical. He's incredibly pro technology,
Yep.
right? He was a big backer, famously, of bills that led to the creation of the modern internet in 1991. Once he had become a senator, he
Which he
backed the
invented.
well, we'll get to that in a second. The High Performance Computing Act of 1991. He led to like the expansion of the existing sort of ARPANET into what became the modern internet, essentially. And he some people claim he even coined the phrase, although there's debate about this, the information superhighway. If you remember that gem from the
Of
90s,
course.
but this sort of like his advocacy or his like mentioning of this advocacy is what led to the like much lambasted claim that he invented the internet, which is not something he ever said in any way. He
Which
said,
I think did it make it into a Simpsons episode even,
oh
didn't it?
yeah, I mean
Yeah.
it's one of the five things I think about
Yes.
immediately on thinking of Al
I
Gore,
think
right?
most people
Probably that's maybe the first thing I think
would
of.
say invented the internet. Most people our age and older, and then the second thing would be climate change.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Um, Apparently there was a Wired magazine
Number three is
article.
is winning a presidential election and not getting to be president. Just perfect.
A brutal trinity. Yeah, yeah. He didn't say this, but it was a good example of like, Gore was like, it's perfect for him, right? Like he said he did something good that was important, and it just gets twisted in the right way,
Yeah.
to make
Well,
him
and
seem ridiculous,
it's sort
essentially.
of similar to his climate change advocacy, which was early and did
Yeah,
bring him to DC in a way that it wasn't before, as ineffective as it ended up being. But I think it sort of gets to the point of, and we'll get into this, I think, a bit later, but how they did go after Gore from the time of the 2000 election through his Inconvenient Truth attempt to save the world or what have you. That like they take the things that are actually, I would say, probably the best of Gore, leaving
yeah.
aside whatever the anti-communism,
Well, we'll
the
come to that in a
deranged
second.
pro-capitalist. Yeah. But the things that like actually kind of were interesting about Gore and turn them on their head and put them into this character of
Yeah,
dull, out of touch,
yeah, yeah,
totally self-satisfied, no clue about, the world, as it were, wanting to take credit for things as a vice president that he shouldn't. And it worked. It's very similar to, what the right-wing media ecosystem did with, it's totally different in the way they attack them, but Hillary and swift boating with John Kerry, all in the
yeah.
same era of like, this is, working against these people so effectively. And what they found with Gore was to make him look like this out of touch
Like a robot.
elitist, which he was. We'll get into. He was out of touch, right? But
Yeah,
like not in the way that they exactly the way that they were. It's like a wildly effective
yeah, yeah.
tactic.
So I skipped over some stuff. Basically, Gore goes to Congress late 70s, becomes a senator mid 80s. He runs for president in 88 and finishes third after Dukakis and Jesse Jackson. People forget that Jesse Jackson was the runner up in that
Yeah.
Democratic primary. Uh, Gore viciously attacked Jackson throughout his campaign.
Stunned to learn. Stunned to learn it.
Yeah, yeah. He said that Jackson, had embraced Castro and Yasser Arafat, and
Oh
but
gosh.
Gore defined himself as a Southern moderate, and he was like, "We'll never. There'll be no federal funding for abortions." He also was the one who discovered the furlough program in Massachusetts, the infamous Willie Horton ads that Bush would
No.
then. Yeah, this is what
Like
always
his team,
happens.
his team did.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
I like
Like
the idea of like, Al Gore being like, I
Al Gore's
invented the
like
Willie
in,
Horton ad.
he's like he's in the archive, like going through
Yeah.
newspaper
Doing
clippings.
the B-roll. He's looking.
Exactly. You mentioned his early advocacy because he published in I think 1991 a book called Earth in the Balance,
Mhm.
which was about global warming. 1991, that's like way ahead of his
Yep.
time. And the book was actually a bestseller and had a big audience. And he called for a Marshall Plan, as he put it, to respond to global warming and other, which is kind of a
Just
forerunner
can't
of
think
the.
outside the box at all.
Well,
It's
it's a
so good.
forerunner of the so-called Green New Deal in a way, right? Like this idea that we're going to use strategies that were successful in previous crises, or and then we're just going to repackage them. I mean, everyone does this,
Sure.
right? This is
Yep.
like American politics 101. He interestingly was opposed to climate adaptation on the grounds of it being lazy, which is hilarious because it's like
Climate adaptation.
meaning
What do
like
you?
sort of like mitigating steps that
Oh, like
slightly,
incremental.
as opposed to like tackling the problem head on and like
Sure.
really trying to radically solve the issue. um and he says it's lazy. It's like, Mr. Gore, do you want to see lazy? Like, look at the subsequent 35 years of policy choices. It's like, what if we just didn't tackle the problem and we also um
And Gore's like, well,
didn't
at least we're not doing climate adaptation.
yeah, like what if we did neither?
Yeah.
Right? So obviously, as vice president, he was sort of elected in '92, very much overshadowed in the early going by Hillary. I don't know if you
Oh
remember
yeah.
this, but Hillary got that
Yeah. She felt
big.
like the main behind the scenes figure
Well,
for
she was the
sure.
first lady to have a substantial kind of policy brief,
Yeah.
at least for a while. And yeah, like defended Clinton during the whole Lewinsky thing. He's like, he's my friend, and I believe him.
Were they friends? Bullshit.
Well, the interesting thing is they were both Southerners. They were about the same age, right?
Yeah.
And this really went against the kind of historical model, which is like you do two vice presidents should be like either older or younger and like regionally distinct,
Yeah, some sort
right?
of
Like
necessary geographical location
yeah,
information.
which just in the nature of electoral college, etc., makes sense in theory. But they bucked the trend and were elected twice. So, you
Yeah.
know, basically, like the whole Lewinsky thing is fascinating because I remember in high school, once again, all the students were conservative, but the teachers were all radically left wing at this conservative boarding school I went to. And one of our teachers was like it's very funny, he's so outraged by the Lewinsky thing. And he got up and he made this like speech about how, and this guy was like a hardcore lefty. He'd like published a book about direct action in the 60s and stuff. And he was like, I
Hmm.
just hope that President Clinton will wait to resign until a certain date because then we could have 10 years of Al Gore as president. Because you know,
One could dream.
if you become president after the halfway point of if you're the vice president, you can run for re-election twice. But if you become
Right.
early, you can only do it once. Anyway,
Did anyone say that about Lyndon Johnson at the time?
well, Lyndon Johnson could have
He
run
could have,
for it,
right? Yeah.
yeah, but just chose not to because of
Sure.
Vietnam. But anyway, then we get to the 2020, the 2020, the 2000 election in which he chooses Joe Lieberman, uh, Connecticut senator. Uh, Not the most uh, very
I
moderate,
totally
very.
forgot about that. Oh my God, what a
You want to
disaster.
hear a funny story about Joe Lieberman? In around a couple years after this, I was sitting in New Haven with my then girlfriend, and we were um, having like lunch at a outdoor cafe, and out of the corner of my eye, I look over and Joe Lieberman is like walking down the street. And I look over at him. I'm like, I have a like, oh, it's Joe Lieberman. And he looked at me like I was Lee Harvey Oswald. Like he was like, yeah, I've like this look of like hatred like flashed in his eyes and like fear and like and I was like, what's going on? Like and he was the senator for my state at the
Yeah,
time.
yeah. So you were a
And
constituent, yeah.
I was a college student. Well, I had graduated, but I was like, I was,
Yeah.
and I was like literally dressed in like running shorts and a t-shirt. Um,
Heinous.
Very weird moment. I'll never forget the look of just like,
I
ah.
remember when he got the gig, when he got the VP nod.
Well, remember McCain
And I
wanted him to be his VP also.
Yeah, like you see, I remember this, and it's like you see so when I saw him for the first time, it was the feeling like this just got a little harder. You know, you could sort of tell the media, you could sort of tell immediately that this was a fucking bad call. It just was not going to hit with anybody. I remember you just thinking like, who was this for? You
I mean,
know,
again,
like
it's the weird thing of like tacking to the middle, right?
yeah,
I mean, the thing with Gore is, despite people tarring him for being a leftist or something, he is insanely conservative for a
yep,
Democrat, sanely moderate, as we say now, and utterly anti-communist, rabidly anti-communist. I mean, this comes up in the movie. Well,
yeah,
let's get into the movie. And enough about Gore. Like the movie is interesting, right? um the opening.
yeah.
um
Well, the movie, I think the opening is interesting because it kind of gets at what you're saying, which is that like he he kind of does tack to that more conservative vision of environmentalism you
I'm sorry,
alluded to earlier in the episode.
say that again. That got a little cut
He
off.
kind of he kind of represents a more conservative version of environmentalism, right? Because
Yeah,
he's not, and to him the most important thing in the movie and the thing that was going to create the call for action, right, is you know I'm down by the river. I think we have the clip of
yeah.
him
No, I'll put it in. Yeah.
going off about the beauty of nature and you know.
Right. Well, like the thing is,
But he wants ultimately to be able to like keep his daddy's bull farm
yeah,
and stay on the land. Like that's what it's
the
about
cow.
partly to him. Is like, don't we all want to have our hundreds of acres of farmland because the earth is so important, you know?
Yeah, I think that's one of the things that really bothered me about that. That said, the opening is very romantic with a capital R, right?
Mm-hmm.
What he's emphasizing about nature is that it has non-utilitarian value, that it has a value that is beyond its value as commodity, right? So rather than looking at a forest and thinking, oh, I could sell these logs for, and like we could plow the land and turn it into there's some gas under there that we could drill. Just looking at it and seeing it as something valuable in and of itself, that's like a tenet of 19th century onward romanticism. And I think that's good. Like I
Well,
agree.
it's
Like
also sort of rarefied air for an American political figure. I
in
mean,
the
to just even
twenty
think
first
that,
century,
yeah,
yeah.
to articulate that sort of thought instead of, the thoughts that come later in the documentary.
Yeah, yeah. So he says the great line, I'm Al Gore. I used to be the next president of the United States of America. And then people laugh, and he says, I don't think that's very funny. But it's,
Which is great. I mean, even the line that I remember that line from watching the movie the first time. Like, I'm Al
yeah,
Gore, and I used to be the next president. So it really sums up Gore and the lack of political like courage. It's like he couldn't even come out and be like, I am Al Gore, and by the way, I should have been the president. Instead it's this like loose, funny, like I can't look at this head
mitigated.
on the fact that it was taken from me. So instead I'll do like my little bit here. And it doesn't even crush.
Yeah, it doesn't crash. I mean, imagine that's like the best because they filmed a lot of these slideshows,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
And
yeah,
that's like the best. Just they're like, all
That's
right, we
the
gotta
best
go,
one, yeah.
we gotta go with that one. Like, um, after his little intro stuff, he starts the film with a picture of the earth, right? He takes us out. One thing the film does a lot of is it moves from the very personal, intimate, usually centered around Gore and his family, to the macro perspective, talking about tens
Yep.
of thousands, hundreds of thousands of years. These like global, pulling all the way back, looking at the image of the earth, the first one that was taken from space that you could see all of the without any of it in shadow, right? And like he's not super funny, but he is funny enough for what the film and the presentation needs him to be. Interestingly, my dad, I think in the late 90s, went to one of those Friars Club type like political events, and Al Gore was the featured speaker. And he came back, and
Was
I
he
was
doing
like,
a set?
yeah, basically. Like it wasn't like but it was like a political dinner where
Sure.
where politicians get up and like make self-effacing speeches. I'm sure it wasn't like, Seinfeld 1988 or whatever.
Yeah, yeah.
But my dad said Gore was very funny, and I remember thinking at the time, eh, like what?
Yeah.
But I think Gore is more, he is livelier in this, and he is funnier and like somewhat self-aware, even as he still is like quite robotic on a basic level. Do you agree? I mean, you're our resident
Well, I
comedy
mean, I think
expert.
Gore, I think by '06 has strangely become like a very confusing amalgamation of factors, if that
Yeah,
makes sense. All of this baggage of his past that he doesn't really shy away from. You do get the feeling of weight and disappointment still, even with
yeah.
the
The sort
levity
of
that exists.
the tragic failure,
Yeah, there's
like
occasionally like, oh, the things I would have done, or oh, what it would have been like, which is fair, I think. And then
yeah.
not that I think that he would have saved the world or solved climate change at
Sure,
all,
sure.
obviously. But there is that, and then there's all of the like weird ideas that we all have in our head about Al Gore by '06, right? That as a result of participating in this media ecosystem for a decade and a half and watching him. And then we do get this like contrast of him being this kind of like humorous down home Southern type
Yeah,
sometimes,
yeah, yeah,
with then this poking through of this messianic complex sort of too, that like he
yeah.
actually thinks like, once I get this rolling,
Like
this,
this is going to be the first. The waterfall begins
and
with the
maybe he
first
didn't,
drop.
maybe he didn't think that, but the
Yeah.
way it comes off is like, it's almost like, oh well, it all feels to be compensating for 2000 in a way of like, I will end up being almost this, like the great man
What?
of history will be Al Gore in the end because of
Yeah,
my PowerPoint presentation.
I think that's right. And this is the greatest film in the history of PowerPoint presentations that have
Oh,
become
it's not even
films.
close. What would number two be?
I mean, it's very funny. As a teacher, I have students give presentations all the time. They love to do PowerPoint. So I'm like very familiar with this sort of and seeing Gore just do it, I'm like, oh wow, yeah, Gore really got the ball rolling on this PowerPoint
He
movement.
absolutely, I mean, and not to mention, it's like they're also like the filler of the movie, the B-roll is him like putting it together as though
It's
he
like
hasn't
him
done it,
working on the PowerPoint.
working on it, but then not just the PowerPoint. So like he's got a lot of laptop shots. He's on the train, but he's got no time. He's got to keep putting the PowerPoint together. And
Yeah,
then it also goes into like news stories, like stories of the Bush administration ignoring climate change. And it looks like he's
yeah,
like almost in like, he thinks he's in like the Pelican Brief, and he's gonna like
yeah.
break the big scoop that will finally usher in. And like the thing is that it's weird because I have such a negative view of basically all of these political figures.
Yeah,
What comes through in Inconvenient Truth is, despite everything that he's, I think, rightfully criticized for, and why we will talk about how I think this ultimately fails, it's very hard, given the history of Al Gore, to not have this shred of sympathy
totally.
for this character. Not that he deserves it, but it's affecting sometimes. You're like, you almost want to believe the delusion, given everything that's happened over the last 24 years, that, what did
If
you describe it as when we were talking about it before? A hinge point that somehow
yeah, yeah,
Gore, it just could have been at least different enough, but it's probably not true. But there is this romantic notion that just comes through every now and then of like, well, he does actually talk about the environment as a value in and of itself. He does talk about a type of thinking
yeah,
and perception that is totally outside of the American political mainframe. He doesn't
yeah.
get outside the capitalist mainframe, but
At
like
all.
no
Yeah,
no other guy, the only other person who did it purely for effect was an Obama when he's running in 08
sure.
talking about like the seas have been healed simply by like giving this man the nomination or whatever he said.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
it had sort of reached a point of farce almost by then, that like we were so far beyond
yeah. And
say,
I think that Obama obviously far more uh adept politician, like
oh yeah,
far more cynical also, right? I
far
mean,
far more
just
cynical. And like, but to be fair, like Gore really, I think, gave him the platform to use the environment cynically, right? He
yeah.
really did sort of
No, it's
fall on the
true.
grenade and become the whack job leftist environmental guy, so
Yeah.
that by the time Obama's going for it, it's like, no man, like this shit's serious. And even though he wasn't about to do anything to solve it at all, um,
Yeah, yeah.
it allowed for that expression in a way that I think Gore was way more muted in 2000 on it.
Yeah. What do you think about the various props and tricks in the film that Gore uses to illustrate his points? Like there's the cartoon, which I found to be kind of cringe and ridiculous. It's like a Simpsons knockoff cartoon almost. Then there's the contraption, as he calls it, that's sort of a
He
scissor
gets on a
lift.
skyjack, yeah,
Yeah.
scissor lift, and he follows I actually liked the scissor lift bit.
Yeah,
As
yeah.
the performer, I'd say I was kind of surprised at how well he timed it with the
With
actual chart,
the red dot going
but he
up.
still
Yeah.
couldn't resist the like talk about off the charts while he's still on the chart.
Yeah, yeah.
Classic mix up, you know,
Yeah.
like, well, you just, you made a bigger chart, man. It's not off of anything. But I don't know. I mean, I think the whole presentation, you kind of have to try to put yourself in '06.
Yeah.
And I think you're also in this really interesting illustration of, we're already really in our echo chambers in a way that becomes more and more severe as the sort of internet and online life take over politics. but like it's just a group of people nodding along with Al Gore,
Yeah.
hearing what they feel they know and what does make them better than people who like, don't even think it's real. Like that's we always do this, that they always did this in this era, that was like, let's ridicule the right and their opposition to it by talking about how stupid they are for thinking it's not real, as though we can't even conceive of the fact that that is itself a political and effective, cynical way of preventing any type of legislation or uh, whatever awareness of climate change. Instead, the liberal left, the Democratic left, was already doing this thing. It's kind of like when Obama would go around in 2016 and help, the campaign by basically turning into a stand-up comedian
Yeah.
and making fun of Trump the way he did at the correspondence dinner that led to this whole fucking thing
That
in the
went so
first place.
well. Yeah.
And he's like, this guy's out here selling steaks. And it's like, dude, man, I guess you don't know what the fuck is going on then.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's how I
Uh,
feel about the Gore presentation. It's like, it's built for, it's not built to reach anybody else.
well,
I don't think.
it's primarily given to like college students, right? And like,
Right. But the only way that he thinks of branching out into anything outside of the 51% or whatever people who voted for him is to assure everybody that their economic success and life would not be disturbed under any situation as long as we got going.
yeah, we'll come back to that at the end. But I think the thing that I was really struck by is despite everything that had happened to him in his career, Gore is so naive, right? There's
Oh,
just this
tragically.
tragic naivete. He says once he learned about climate change in college and then, followed it through his early time in Congress and the Senate, he has this thing where he's like, I'll just bring the scientists in and we'll like tell the other congressmen, and then America will like get in gear and democracy
Yeah.
will like do the work that
Awareness
we
awareness equals action.
yeah, which is
Classic flaw of liberal politics in my
yeah, it's
lifetime.
not how things have been trending. Right? I mean, even when you have Trump be like, yes, and like these great vaccines are I did that. Even then, like his followers still hate them, right? I mean,
Yeah,
it's
that's right.
like there's like no I don't know. I just found it very interesting.
Well,
And then
there's no body of proof that this type of thing can work without any institutional analysis, which is kind of what the Democrats have always tried to do, right?
what do you mean by
And
institutional analysis?
or okay, so how do I explain this quickly? I would say that from the likes of Gore all the way through, the way to, for example, go after the skeptics is to talk about the people who don't think it's real. Or, there's only a brief moment in the documentary in Inconvenient Truth where he has the one quote that shows that there are these industries and these powerful people
Yeah, yeah,
behind
yeah, yeah,
the distortion of climate science that says like we want to position global warming as a theory, not as a fact.
yeah,
Okay. Now he says that that's what's happening, but he doesn't address then like politically what you need to explain to people at all, which is you are not fighting an election by voting against someone who is so stupid they think climate change isn't real.
right.
You are fighting a political battle
A
where the people who
literal cabal of corporations that have
you're talking
conspired.
about like a concentration
I
of
mean, it
power and
is
wealth.
ironically, it is a conspiracy.
Well, right, and this is something that in every single issue of my lifetime, it feels the Democrats have never come to grips with. So
Yeah,
instead, they're out. Pete Buttigieg is out there being like, "Well, yeah, we want healthcare for everyone, but man, there's a lot of people who like their job, their employer healthcare. Got to take care of them. Let them stay on their plan." And you're like, "You're a fucking idiot. That's
it's like,
not the political battle
what
that's
are you
going on."
talking about?
Right.
Yeah,
There's an entire body of our political structure that is designed to make sure we can't go to the doctor for free
yeah,
or
no,
can't go to the
exactly.
doctor because of the
Oh,
government.
yeah, yeah,
And this is the same way with climate change. And they have done this for a very long time. And when you watch Inconvenient Truth, it's kind of like a real perfect distillation of that
yeah,
because he is doing some things that some people will talk about some reviews, I think, soon, but talks about some of the distortions he made, some of the hyperbole he chooses. Frankly, I don't give a fuck about that. Like, I
Yeah.
really don't. But he then cannot like actually get through the looking glass and be like, so how does this work? And instead, well, we can get into that
Yeah.
soon.
One other thing I wanted to talk about was just Gore always like frames things through his individual experience, right? Even when he talks about writing his like son had a terrible was hit by a car when he was a small child, and while the kid was recovering, that's when Gore wrote his first climate change book. Later, he makes an analogy between um, corporate inaction and the tobacco lobby, which ties into what you were just talking about, right? It says, for years, tobacco companies knew that cigarettes caused cancer. And then he's like, my sister smoked and she died, right? So he like, which
Right.
I think is smart in terms of like filmmaking, like tying things to individual events that we as individuals ourselves can relate to. But it kind of comes back to that thing the theme of this show so far, which is this like constant need to focus on like the individual and this inability to reckon with the necessity of collective action, right? And there's a couple of other things that he does bring up. I want to give him some credit because, like you, I'm like pretty critical of Al Gore. Like this film reminded me of a lot of things about him that I'd kind of repressed or forgotten. I
Yes,
thought
absolutely.
he was cooler and more left wing than he was. He's like a rabid anti-communist in a way that just feels so like over. Like, what are
Yeah.
you talking about? Even in like the 2000s,
Yeah.
he's like, we got to celebrate our triumph over like the USSR. It's like, do we though? Like, it's a while ago. Like, that was like not totally great in a lot of ways. But one thing he does mention is like, look, climate change is going to bring about a lot of environmental shifts and niches, and that these are going to, lead to the rise of new illnesses. So we'll play the clip here. And like, he's ahead of his time there, right? He mentioned SARS. He's like West
Mhm.
Nile, SARS, all these other like, and it would be about 14 years later. And I know there's still a lot of debate about the origins of COVID. Some people are very sure it was a lab leak. Other people think it was zoonotic in origin. I'm not a scientist. Um, I don't feel that strongly either way. I tend to think it was probably natural because things like this have happened before.
Mhm.
Um, but regardless, the rise of new pandemics and things like this because of like animals shifting their like patterns of life and moving into places where humans are that they previously didn't, like that's he's right on about that. Like that
Yeah.
is an issue, and that is uh, the film is a little bit of a parade of facts, all bad, right? And like I think about like an hour and 10 minutes in, I was like, man, this is kind of dragging a little bit for me. It's just like punching you over and over again with
Well,
like,
that's it's an interesting thing from a filmmaking perspective, is I think that if it was actually a presentation, it would be shorter, but because they're putting it in theaters, you have to remember this was like pretty successful at the box office.
yeah,
And
no, it
and
made
so
like
like you
$50
could feel
million
that they were
dollars.
stretching it. Yeah, you could feel they were stretching it to make sure it was like came in at 80 minutes or whatever so that it could be
It
a
could
movie.
it could be up for Oscar.
And it won. It won the Oscar.
It was up for
So I
Oscar
mean,
and it
who are we to
triumphed.
say, right?
Yeah,
Yeah,
Gore.
Al Gore's big triumph. He did get the statue at
Yeah,
least
yeah.
in the end, right?
Well, fair enough, right?
I mean,
Um,
that was when I watched the disease part. I was like, it brought back like I remember how I was in Toronto during SARS, which got hit pretty hard,
yeah, there
right?
actually was SARS in
They had the
Toronto.
concert there. That's where the Stones came and saved the day, or AC/DC and whatever.
Nice.
Uh, and a bunch of Canadians famously threw water bottles at Justin Timberlake because they were there to see AC/DC, not this hack shit. But that's another story. But I remember just
Cold.
like, being like, I'm obviously a pretty paranoid guy, but like, I was like scared of that shit.
Oh
And
yeah.
now you're like, you put it in perspective, like West Nile compared to what we have had unfold
Yeah.
over the last 4
Seems
years
quite
it's fucking,
quaint.
it's just a different plant. It's a different experience, you know?
Yeah,
Uh,
no, it's very true. But you know, give him credit for being on top of like the some of the eventualities. He also goes to China in the film, very interesting. And there's a scene of him like talking shop with like some Chinese officials about like coal power plant usage and stuff like that. Uh I think again, it's refreshing, even if like probably completely ineffective, to see an American politician, if one out of office, you know, like talking internationally about these issues. Like that's in the age of like hyper polarization against China, which quite frankly I find ridiculous. Um, it's difficult to imagine, you know, like
yeah.
reaching across
But like when
the
it's weird the way that they do it in the film, like when he starts talking about China, you almost think he's just going to start levying a bunch of hate and critique about their usage of carbon. And
yeah,
instead it's like, well, they're actually paying attention
yeah,
to this.
which is
But
true.
again, like it gets to that real problem with the movie, which is kind of like he goes through all the way. He gets up there with the tobacco industry, but then you can't make any
Yeah,
industrial
I
or
mean,
macro
he's
connection.
utterly beholden to capitalism, right?
That's
He
right.
keeps coming back to capitalism. He talks about, hey guys, like once we start fighting climate change, it's going to create so many new
It's
jobs.
literally the
So many,
first positive impact is there will be other jobs to work.
yeah,
Like
and he
you're talking about like singing this beautiful song about the environment at the beginning of the movie
and then
and
he's
how
like,
like
but think about the new
think
like
about the
types of
jobs you'll have. We're talking 17, $19 an hour, full benefits. You know, like what a hilarious mission for the Messiah,
he
to
also
make sure that you're like
says,
making
yeah,
$65,000 a
he
year.
al- he also says carbon capture is going to be like a big, you know, we're going to like suck the carbon out of the air. And
Yep.
they've started to do that, but I mean like the scale at which that would need to be done to have a
Well,
noticeable effect is
right.
staggering.
And part of the again, I think this goes more to the idea of this podcast so far is that like when conceiving of what's exciting or inspiring about this action,
Yeah.
it's there will be jobs we can't even imagine the type of work we'll have to do. And then think about all the cool toys we will continue to have, as opposed to any reckoning for like the responsibility of industry uh, and it's trampling over the environment and our resources that led to this point in the first place. It's like again, it comes back down to this classic notion of Gore and these liberal politics, which is like, yeah, we'll still trust them just enough. We'll hold their feet to the fire, but at the end of the day, we'll get a task force. We'll see what we can do, and we'll ultimately trust these people. You know, Bush isn't going to actually steal the election, is he? Let's just make sure we're making our case in court or whatever.
Yeah, yeah,
Over
yeah.
and over and over again. And all these years later, he is still in a situation where he's like, once we make it economically powerful, then all these evil fucking people who have led us to this moment will all come around because they'll be able to hire you. Good jobs. And they'll be able to make, new toys.
Yeah,
And the world will be saved.
you'll get to work in the carbon mines. It'll be great, you know. No more coal
That's right.
mining. You'll be like at the carbon capture
Right. Well, the
factory.
carbon capture part of the documentary where he has the great line where he's like, where he starts his cell and he's like, political will, that's a renewable resource. And it's like, dude, man,
It's
like,
like,
have you not?
bro, what are you talking about?
And even from a sympathetic look at Gore, it's like, dude, have you even lived your own life?
Yeah,
What
it's
are you talking
really,
about? Your life is a refutation of that idea.
you know, and
Like,
he says things like, you know, we won the Civil War.
oh, I love this
We
part.
defeated fascism. We defeated the Soviet Union. And I'm
Mhm.
thinking as I'm watching this, we eliminated slavery, right? And I'm
Yep.
like, all of these things took and cost an enormous amount of violence, right?
Yep.
Like none of
Violence,
these
death,
like
institutional shifts that occurred or didn't. I mean, massive
unfathomable
changes.
scope of
Right. But
changes in
but
perspective.
for this one, it's just like
We have a
bring your
documentary.
bags to the yeah, bring your own bags to the grocery line, and
Yeah.
we'll start doing the real work. It's
Yeah.
so amazing. it comes right on the heels of all this like world. We won World War II, so now we'll
What
just
and
start
what do we
using
have to
LED light bulbs.
yeah, and like what did we
Same
have
thing,
to do to
exact same
win World War
process.
II, right? We just
We had to use fluorescent lights. Like, like
uh
what the?
so I mean just kind of wrapping up, like he ends with the famous pale blue dot photo of the Earth from
Mm.
millions of miles away by one of the Voyager spacecrafts, right? And so he sort of ends where he began, and the final moments of the film are back at the river. It's like, wow, bookends. The beginning, the end, it rhymes. It's like poetry.
It's gonna save
Uh,
the cat moment for Al Gore.
what
You
do you
got
mean?
the mirror image at the end of the movie.
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah. Exactly. He's the kind of guy who I think the presentation is good. Like he was right about a lot of the stuff. Most of the facts in the film are correct or have been borne out by what's happened since. Some of them are exaggerated. We'll talk about that in a second. But like he's the kind of guy who like opposes the Vietnam War, um, but goes anyway to help his
Yep.
dad get reelected, and then the re-election fails.
Yep.
It's like he and like he accepts, like we've been talking about the Supreme Court, and once again, the movie ends with like a call to personal action that is
Always.
like that is like what we've been saying. He's like, you know, limit power usage, like turn the water off while you're
Yep.
brushing your teeth. Like these
Right.
kind
The last thing I would say about that is that like there's two things. One is that you're right. He makes this sort of almost objectively like compelling case
yeah,
for the need to action, but the ground has shifted and people are already not listening. And I
yeah,
think that's what you start to realize watching it back.
yeah.
In retrospect, where we were in '06, maybe you thought that a figure like that might help some, but the fact of the matter is the wheels were already moving so far away from this type of action or politics. And the second thing I would say is that yeah, he is lost in this trap of thinking things are possible while proving that they are not possible, right?
Yeah.
And when it comes to the individual, the call for the individual, I think that sort of sums up the last 20 years and gets at what I think about all of this, really, which is that even people listening, once they get to that garbage about your shopping bags and your light bulbs and all, remember he had the list of all the ways that that would eat into carbon, which is like probably somewhat true. There's no doubt that if every individual acted in this specific
If
way, it would have
if
an
every
impact.
individual
If every
acted
individual,
as a
but
group.
right, but what it does is it makes people realize that a that's not going to happen, and at a level even subconscious, they know that that type of thing is not going to happen,
Yeah.
and it's in concert with this feeling that the real change, the institutional change that doesn't even get addressed, never mind fails or doesn't exist, is impossible. And so that's why you get like, it's very easy, I think, with climate change to be like, why are we not doing anything when we all know that like we're fucked, or at least many millions, billions of people maybe are going to be seriously impacted. And I think that sadly, that's part of what it comes down to is that like the need, the desire or will to do anything individually is even further eroded because there's no sense of any collective
Yeah.
action being, manifested or political action being possible.
No, I agree. I think that's well said. Let's talk about a couple of the reviews. So Ebert, big time lib.
Let's talk about Ebert.
Uh,
Let's definitely talk. We're in '06. Let's talk about Ebert.
yeah, yeah. He says, what can we do? This is from his review of June 1st, 2006. Switch to and encourage the development of alternative energy sources, solar, wind, tidal, and yes, nuclear.
Gasp, gasp.
Yeah, move quickly towards hybrid and electric cars, pour money into public transit, subsidize the fares, save energy in our houses. All right, the public transit stuff, hybrid cars, energy source, that's all good. Save energy in our houses, again, yes, if everyone does it, great. But on a case by case basis, not that much. He says, I did a funny thing when I came home from seeing An Inconvenient Truth. I went around the house turning off the lights, which I think is great because now
What a great line. It's like also the idea of him being like
I'm just
active
picturing
trying to portray that he's been like radicalized by the movie. Like
turn the lights on.
Roger Marks Ebert has
Yeah.
emerged from the theater, but it's like first of all, it's like funny to think that he didn't know to turn the lights off.
Well, that's what
Like
I'm thinking. I'm also
so
just
funny.
picturing Ebert's like mansion just aglow at like 3 a.m. It's just like every light
Right,
is
right, right,
on. It's like
right.
sitting on a hill. It's like, oh, that's the old
You know,
Ebert
it's
place. Yeah, he doesn't turn the lights on.
date night. He's come back. He's had a
Yeah,
great
yeah,
time at the movies. I mean, yeah, I mean, all of these things, it's funny. It's like all of these very base ideas that he says in his review of the movie, like just pouring money into public transit, not a bad idea.
how's
How
that
have we been
going?
doing? How have we been doing
Oh
over the
wait,
last?
are there any billionaires that are like directly trying to subvert that with pie in
Yeah,
the
yeah,
sky nonsense?
right. But I
Uh,
wait longer for the bus. Save the world. I'm late. I got fired. I didn't get to work on time because there's never a bus. But I'm not about to drive my own car. You know.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Let's look at A.O. Scott's take. He says Gore's presence, this is also from around that same time in the New York Times. Gore's presence is in some ways a distraction since it guarantees an inconvenient truth will become fodder for the cynical, ideologically facile sniping that often passes for political discourse these days.
Interesting.
Just wait, A.O. Scott.
Yeah,
It's
yeah.
not getting better anytime soon. But really, the idea that worrying about the effect of carbon dioxide emissions on the world's climate makes you some kind of liberal kook is as tired as the image of Gore as a stiff, humorless speaker. Eh, someone to make fun of rather than take seriously. This is not everything you need to know about
Jesus.
global warming. That's the point, but it's a good place to start and to continue a process of education that could hardly be more urgent. Like Inconvenient Truth, An Inconvenient Truth is a necessary film. I think that's like pretty good, right? Like I agree
I
with
think
most.
it's interesting that it
The defense of Gore as like not a stiff, humorless speaker is a little bit of a stretch,
yeah.
but
Yeah. Although in fairness, he is marginally less stiff and marginally more humorous in this than he was
oh
in
yeah,
his
yeah.
last public go round. But I do think it's an interesting point. I don't think it's true, but I think it's funny. Like,
Who would the
yeah, I guess
messenger have been
he
instead?
would be a distract. I think it's fair to say he was a distraction.
Yeah,
Not that you could have avoided it, maybe, but like right away, the way the movie was consumed by anybody who wasn't in the bag for Al Gore or climate was like this fucking guy again
yeah,
coming
yeah,
back
yeah,
here with his fucking bullshit. Would he
yeah,
also
yeah,
invent the internet and we
yeah,
just went
yeah,
right back into this game?
yeah, yeah. That's what I
I
meant
mean,
earlier when I said like it's not changing hearts and minds, right? Like
right. The
he's
question is like, what what changes hearts? It's like
well,
what
like
changes hearts
who
and
is
minds?
the
Who?
host? We were talking off mic, like
Right. This isn't like a TV show, so it's like you can't have Tom Brokaw and hope to win an Oscar and get people to
no, no.
come.
What about Dan Marino?
I mean, I think
What about
or just like each act is done by a different retired NFL quarterback.
Joe Montana, Terry
Terry Bradshaw,
Bradshaw,
I think would be very
yeah.
good in this role.
And then like Hulk Hogan. I've always felt like Terry Bradshaw and Hulk Hogan were kind of
Well, I
similar.
think, yeah, I don't know. I mean, I would say,
Michael
you know, maybe
Jackson, Jackson was still alive. I mean, he did that heal the world, Free Willy stuff, right? This
sure.
isn't his wheelhouse.
I think like maybe Jackson for the soundtrack.
Oh,
You know,
sure.
we get the Free Willy like da da na 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 would have
Oh
been like a
yeah,
nice way to end it.
please,
But
please.
you know, this is maybe a shameless segue, but I actually do think that like a Hollywood star maybe still would have been like Costner. You bring Kevin Costner into this,
Okay.
you get those good looks, the jawline, and he's speaking Al Gore's words. You know, maybe that does better. You know, because you know
Yeah.
now all these years later, he's got Yellowstone. You
Yeah,
know,
yeah, yeah,
for a lot of those people, he's on the right side of history. Was
yeah. Yeah, I feel that. What about the detractors to Gore? Well, there's Greg Easterbrook in Slate. Dings Gore for he says we have to spend too much time trying to impress us with the Ask Mr. Science side of Gore's personality.
love it.
Yeah, perfect. Fewer details might have made the movie more effective, especially given that some of the details are off. And he points to like one of the big pieces in Gore's thing is if we don't do this, like the 9/11 memorial is going to be
Oh yeah,
flooded, which is like,
an
oh,
amazing moment.
just so wonderful. It's like we didn't save them on 9/11, and now we can't even save their memorial, right? It's this
Right.
weird and
Right.
it's
If we
like
don't stop
he's
climate
like
change,
digging
then it
bush,
will have happened in
right?
vain.
He's like digging bush also. So that's like an example of like maybe
Right. And
the
the map they show, the water envelops the memorial only
right.
briefly.
And that like that is pretty hyperbolic, right?
But
I mean
but in fairness, yes, that part is so ridiculous. But it also funny that I think guys like Easterbrook sitting there feeling contested by
yeah,
it,
yeah.
like it's not that antagonistic. It's also not that complicated. And it's like the idea that he is sitting there being like, oh, this guy's trying to impress me. Fuck him. Is like such a weirdly
Yeah.
juvenile thing to do when taking in this piece of media.
Yeah, yeah.
Oh, look at Mr. Science up there. I feel uncomfortable. I'm being
Well, and then
threatened or
like,
whatever.
and then to go all the way, Rush Limbaugh
Oh
refers
yeah.
to the film as a award-winning science fiction thriller, which is great. Uh,
He definitely gives it the props of winning awards though, which
oh, of
is,
course, status
you
mattered to
know,
Rush. Remember, Rush wanted to be on ESPN, right?
where he was
Um,
briefly.
well, it didn't go so well. I was
But
watching,
it is kind of,
yeah,
it's funny, like the award-winning science fiction thriller is like, to be fair to Limbaugh here,
it's pretty
like I
funny.
said about the Pelican Brief, like there are these moments of the movie
Yeah,
that do make it feel like,
mostly the B-roll when you cut to Gore, like
yeah, and
there's
he's like
like
putting the pieces together,
his
and
hand
like
on
all it
his
takes is one
chin.
more, right?
Yeah, yeah,
Just
yeah.
this one more slideshow. I'm gonna speak to the right guy, and it's all gonna happen.
Yeah.
And
Limbaugh's
I'm gonna call out the current forces of power, bring this whole shit show down. It does
yeah.
feel like that a little bit.
Yeah, yeah. Limbaugh says the sole purpose of this campaign, this is a campaign Gore raised $300 million after this film to like spearhead.
Yeah,
Uh and Limbaugh's like, this is from 2008, I believe. Global warming is the whole purpose of this campaign of man-made global warming is to convince more and more Americans and citizens of the world to turn over more and more of their liberty to big government,
God forbid.
to allow big government to have more and more control over private sector businesses. It's nothing more than a disguised government expansion program, typical liberalism. Really? Like I wish liberalism was like doing
Yeah.
government expansion. Like,
Well, that's, I mean, that's what my whole experience with the right wing media,
it's like
my whole life
what are
is
you talking about?
they describe a boogeyman that I wish existed.
Yeah, yeah.
Like if only some of
Yeah.
these things were true that you're using to prevent any of them from ever coming to pass.
This is interesting what Limbaugh says next. Everybody wants to matter. Everybody wants their life to have meaning. So, if they can be fooled into thinking that they are going to pay for their carbon footprint, that will help clean up the planet and prevent this destructive climate change, they'll be more than happy to do it. Meanwhile, the people who they're paying will be laughing all the way to the bank because it's just one of the biggest scams to come down the pike. The one thing about this that to me is encouraging is that Gore's movie didn't do its job, and all the free publicity and all the propaganda did not do its job. Otherwise, there would be no need for this 300 million campaign. Like, Rush, I love the fantasy where like one movie just like solves climate. Like what? Of
No,
course,
after
of
you go see
course.
the movie, you come out and you have to start paying your carbon footprint that
Yeah,
day.
like what's I don't know. It's pretty
Well, but again, like what's
disingenuous.
interesting is that like there's something in there about people kind of getting fooled into thinking
That
that
small individual changes are
paying for their
all
carbon
that's
footprint
needed.
will
Yeah,
solve
yeah,
all of this. And that's
yeah,
kind of funny. But it does also seem like, you know, when all of these things that both Rush Limbaugh are like, they're coming for all our freedoms. There's going to be more
yeah,
state control. And on the other side, Al Gore being like, don't worry, there won't be any of that. We're still
yeah,
going to like
yeah,
get
yeah,
there.
yeah.
And then you look at him praising China and showing the chart of like the mileage standards that they already have.
Yeah.
And you're like, oh, does that have anything to do with state controls? Or was that they all just came together because they watched Inconvenient Truth before it came out?
Yeah.
They got the like
Right.
the
Was
first
like,
cut.
wait, you mean these strong regulations? Were they just the business just like submitted to them willingly?
No,
Because
they just everyone in China just loves their rivers so much and the distant calling of cows in the background that they were so romantically affected already that they decided to have higher mileage standards. And I think that's like funny that at the end of the day, you listen to Limbaugh and you listen to Gore, they're not actually at complete opposition.
No, they're not too far apart in weird ways.
Yeah.
I agree. Just wrapping up, there was a sequel to Inconvenient Truth. Maybe you heard of it. Probably not. I feel like it
Called
got
Truth to Power.
yeah,
And he's still doing
and
it.
it's called An Inconvenient Sequel. Like,
Yeah.
what is this? Like Naked Gun 2.5? Like, what are
Yeah.
like what are we doing here? Yeah, it made $2 million as opposed to the $50 million. I honestly
should have got like an expanded Inconvenient Truth universe would have been funny. But I guess it was too early for that.
Yeah. No, 2017. Like that was
I guess they were all
that was like
that,
well underway.
Yes, you're right. You're right.
I never heard of this until I started researching for this episode. Like, kind of hilarious to have made such a splash and for the sequel to just be like, yeah, we already know.
I mean, also like pretty emblematic, right? It's like you're what? You're 11 years later, and
well, it's Trump. Trump had just come into office when this came out.
And nobody gives a fuck about Al Gore. Sorry, in 2017. And,
no, it's true.
I mean, to me, wrapping up, it's like I come back all the time to the title, right? An Inconvenient Truth, and it's sort of like it seems like a very Al Gore and American notion.
Convenience.
That the looming end of the world and swallowing up of land by the imminent sea rise, and just a little inconvenient. Don't worry, let's not lose our heads. Few things we're gonna have to start doing, and it's all couched in the language of convenience.
Yeah,
it's too perfect and kind of too tragic.
Yeah, I agree. All right, cool. Well, that was very interesting. What are we talking about next week? You sort of had a little Easter egg in an earlier comment.
Yeah, for our listeners to go back. But the man who may have been able to save us all by delivering the amazing words of Al Gore in Inconvenient Truth, one Hollywood frontman, Kevin Costner. We are doing our first double feature episode. Do you want to explain what we'll be looking at?
We'll be looking at two films from the 90s starring Kevin Costner, one also directed by Costner. The first is infamous Hollywood bomb, although it ended up making money, but never mind, Waterworld. And we'll be following that up with actual bomb and truly ridiculous film, The Postman.
I love the movie, so this will be a fun one.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to it. And remember to subscribe, rate, and review the podcast. Follow us at End of the World WMS on Instagram. And anything else you want to plug, Michael?
No, that's great.
Cool. All right, guys. We will see you again soon.